New Guinea, late 1943. Major Thomas McGuire is trapped. His massive twin-engine P-38 Lightning is caught dangerously low and agonizingly slow, completely surrounded by a swarm of highly maneuverable Japanese Zeros. By every established rule of aerodynamics, a heavy American interceptor entering a low-speed, turning fight against the Featherlight Zero is an absolute death sentence. He is completely outmatched and out of airspeed. Suddenly, McGuire's fighter violently snaps on its back. The nose drops, and the P-38 enters a vicious, seemingly uncontrollable spin. Without taking a single fatal hit, the heavy aircraft plummets like a stone directly toward the dense jungle canopy below, doomed by the very laws of physics. The Japanese pilots watching the Lightning plummet likely assumed they had just witnessed a catastrophic stall, a guaranteed kill without needing to fire a decisive shot. But this terrifying plunge was no mechanical failure. It was a desperate, highly calculated manipulation of the P-38's massive twin-engine architecture. What looks like a pilot losing control is actually a masterclass in exploiting aerodynamic limits, leveraging the brutal physics of differential thrust for split-second survival. This is not a legend about an airplane defying gravity. It is the story of how human ingenuity weaponized a fatal aerodynamic flaw. Deliberately throwing a heavy interceptor into a violent spin at low altitude was an incredibly reckless gamble. The Lightning was notoriously unforgiving, and pushing it into a state of aerodynamic collapse usually meant an unrecoverable dive into the earth. How did American fighter pilots learn to take a lethal design characteristic, a flaw that was already killing aviation cadets back home, and use it to trick an enemy who held every conceivable advantage in a close-quarters dogfight? To understand why a pilot would intentionally throw his aircraft into a catastrophic spin, you have to look at the brutal arithmetic of the Pacific Air War in 1943. In the skies over New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero was the undisputed apex predator of the turning dogfight. The Japanese design philosophy prioritized extreme maneuverability and incredible range above all else. By stripping away heavy armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, Mitsubishi engineers created a fighter with an astonishingly low wing loading. If an engagement devolved into a horizontal, slow-speed turning contest, the Zero could literally fly circles around any Allied aircraft in the theater. American pilots learned very quickly that trying to outturn a Zero was a mathematical impossibility, usually ending with 20mm cannon shells ripping through their cockpits. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was born from an entirely different philosophy. Designed by Kelly Johnson's engineering team back in the late 1930s, it was originally intended for a completely different war. It was built as a high-altitude interceptor, meant to scream up to 30,000 feet and shred incoming bomber formations over Europe or the American coasts. It was a massive machine. Fully loaded, it weighed roughly 3 times as much as a Zero. Powered by 2 heavy Allison V12 engines, it packed all its heavy machine guns and cannons tightly into the central nose nacelle, giving it a devastating, concentrated cone of fire. But that sheer mass and twin-boom architecture came with severe aerodynamic penalties in a close-in knife fight. The P-38 utilized a heavy control yoke instead of a standard fighter stick, and its roll rate at certain speeds was notoriously sluggish. Worse, at low air speeds, the Lightning became actively treacherous. Because of its complex aerodynamics, if a pilot pulled too hard in a slow turn, the aircraft would snap into a violent asymmetric stall. One wing would suddenly lose lift before the other, flipping the massive fighter inverted and throwing it into a terrifying spin. Back in the United States, training accidents involving these low-altitude stalls were already claiming the lives of young aviation cadets before they even saw a combat zone. The 5th Air Force Command in the Pacific, led by General George Kenney, understood this lethal limitation perfectly. To keep his pilots alive against the nimble Japanese fighters, Kenny's staff mandated a rigid, uncompromising tactical doctrine. It was called boom and zoom, a pure form of energy fighting. American pilots were ordered to use the P-38's immense weight and powerful engines to climb high above the Japanese formations. They would dive in at tearing speeds, fire a single devastating burst, and use their accumulated kinetic energy to zoom climb right back up to a safe altitude, completely untouched. The official manual and squadron commanders were absolute on this point. Keep your speed up, maintain your altitude, and under no circumstances were you to enter a turning engagement with a Zero. If you missed your pass, you kept going. You never stayed to fight. But rigid tactical doctrines drafted on chalkboards rarely survive contact with the geographic reality of the Southwest Pacific. New Guinea was an aviation nightmare. The weather was famously unpredictable, dominated by towering cumulus clouds that stretched up to 40,000 feet, violent tropical squalls, and solid layers of overcast that often forced entire formations down to the deck just to maintain visual contact. American pilots could not simply choose to fight at 25,000 feet if the cloud base pushed them down to 1,000. Furthermore, the P-38s were frequently tasked with escorting slow, heavily laden B-25 Mitchells and A-20 Havocs on low-level strafing missions against Japanese shipping and airfields. The fighters were strictly tethered to the bombers, forced to throttle back and bleed off their precious airspeed to stay in formation. Japanese commanders quickly realized this vulnerability. Zero pilots began adapting their tactics, hiding in the blinding glare of the sun or lurking in the tropical cloud layers, waiting for the American formations to get bogged down near the jungle canopy. They would launch sudden, high-speed ambush attacks, deliberately dragging the escorts into a chaotic, low-altitude brawl. In a matter of seconds, an ambush could completely erase the P-38's crucial advantages of altitude and speed. The moment an American pilot found himself low to the water or the dense jungle canopy, boxed in by highly agile Japanese fighters, the strict rules of boom and zoom evaporated. He was trapped in an arena where his aircraft was never meant to be, and in that terrifying, low-speed regime, the pilot was forced to confront a grim reality. Stripped of momentum, the heavy twin-engine machine he was strapped into wanted to kill him just as much as the enemy did. That terrifying reality materialized in the hostile skies over the heavily defended Japanese air bases at Wewak. The pilots of the elite 475th Fighter Group, including a fiercely competitive squadron commander named Major Thomas McGuire, found themselves ambushed and violently dragged into exactly the kind of grinding, low-altitude knife fight they were explicitly ordered to avoid. The airspace above the dense jungle canopy rapidly devolved into a chaotic, swirling melee. Japanese Zeros, brilliantly exploiting the thick tropical overcast and their superior horizontal maneuverability, had successfully boxed the heavy American twin-engine fighters into a lethal, decelerating arena. In the brutal, unforgiving geometry of a turning dogfight, kinetic energy is an absolute requirement for survival, and McGuire was bleeding his away with every agonizing second. Forced into a relentlessly tightening circle right on the deck, his massive P-38 Lightning began to shudder violently as it exhausted its critical airspeed. He was completely out of momentum, far too low to initiate an escape dive, and structurally incapable of outturning the feather-light enemy fighters swarming around him. Glancing back, McGuire confronted the inevitable. A Japanese Zero had perfectly predicted his flight path, cut inside his turning radius, and settled cleanly onto his 6 o'clock position. The Japanese pilot simply had to wait for the heavy American interceptor to stagger in the humid air before pulling the trigger. According to every technical flight manual printed by Lockheed and every strict tactical directive issued by the 5th Air Force Command, McGuire was already a dead man. The standard textbook solution to evading a pursuing fighter, pushing the nose down to trade altitude for airspeed, was mathematically impossible. He did not have the physical altitude to survive the dive. The instinctual, desperate response, pulling harder and harder on the control yoke to force the aircraft into a tighter turn, would only trigger the Lightning's notoriously deadly asymmetric stall, flipping him upside down into the trees. Cornered in a cockpit where standard physics and rigid military doctrine offered no exit, McGuire made a split-second mechanical decision that completely violated every instinct ingrained in an aviator's muscle memory. Remaining locked in the desperate banking turn, his airspeed decaying towards zero, McGuire reached down and deliberately deployed the Lightning's Fowler flaps, massive hydraulic surfaces extending from the trailing edges of the wings, designed strictly to generate lift for slow-speed runway landings, not for violent combat maneuvers. But he did not stop there. As the heavy fighter wallowed and dragged against the immense aerodynamic resistance, McGuire gripped the split-throttle quadrant. In one rapid, highly unnatural motion, he forcefully pulled the throttle lever for his inside engine all the way back, instantly starving that side of the aircraft of power. In the exact same fraction of a second, he shoved the throttle for his outside engine violently forward, ramming it to absolute maximum manifold pressure. He was intentionally subjecting an already stalling 12,000-pound machine to a massive, punishing imbalance of thrust at the worst possible aerodynamic moment. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was uniquely equipped with counter-rotating propellers. The left engine rotated outward to the left, and the right engine rotated outward to the right. This brilliant engineering feature was originally designed by Kelly Johnson's team to cancel out the massive torque effect that usually plagued heavily armed single-engine fighters during takeoff and rapid acceleration. But in the humid, turbulent air over Wewak, Major Thomas McGuire was weaponizing this carefully engineered system by intentionally breaking its equilibrium. When he violently hauled back his inside throttle to the idle stop and slammed the outside throttle perfectly forward to the firewall, he instantaneously introduced a catastrophic imbalance of thrust into the airframe. The outside Allison V12 engine, roaring instantly to maximum manifold pressure, began violently hauling the outer wing forward. Simultaneously, the inside propeller, suddenly starved of fuel and windmilling uselessly at idle, acted as a massive aerodynamic brake, dragging the inside wing violently backward. Combined with the sudden deployment of the Fowler flaps, which mechanically slid backward on steel tracks to artificially increase the surface area and camber of the wing, acting like massive air scoops grabbing the atmosphere, the aircraft hit an aerodynamic brick wall. At a decaying speed of roughly 150 miles per hour, standard control surfaces like ailerons and rudders completely lose their authority. The ambient air simply is not moving fast enough over the aluminum skins to dictate the movement of a 12,000-pound machine. But the raw, unbalanced thrust generated by the split throttles bypassed the control surfaces entirely. This immense power grabbed the aircraft by its center of gravity and aggressively pivoted the entire airframe in midair. The inside wing, starved of airflow and completely stalled by the dragging flap, lost all lift and dropped like a stone. The heavy fighter did not just roll, it snapped violently onto its back. This was not a standard aviation maneuver. It was a savage, structural torsion that threw the pilot hard against his canvas shoulder harnesses. To anyone watching, it looked exactly like a catastrophic, fatal failure of the airframe. From the cockpit of the pursuing Mitsubishi A6M Zero, the visual evidence was absolute. The Japanese aviator, a veteran of the grinding aerial campaigns over the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, was operating a fighter built entirely around the philosophy of the horizontal turn. He had successfully lured the heavy American interceptor into a low-speed tactical trap. Watching the P-38's twin booms shuddering in the humid air, he was carefully managing his own throttle, easing his lightweight fighter into the exact flight path of his prey. He was looking directly through the illuminated glass of his Type 98 reflector gun sight, waiting for the American aircraft to wallow, to hang suspended in the air for just a fraction of a second as it ran completely out of airspeed. He was calculating the lead, anticipating the exact moment to squeeze the trigger and send a burst of 20mm high-explosive shells into the Lightning's cockpit. But suddenly, the massive silver target did not just wallow. It violently convulsed. The right wing dropped rapidly, the nose pitched down at a severe angle, and the entire airframe snapped inverted, tumbling out of the sky in a chaotic, asymmetrical plunge toward the dense green canopy of the New Guinea jungle. To the Japanese pilot, who intimately understood the strict boundaries of lift and drag, there was only one logical explanation. The American pilot, panicked and desperate to escape the turning circle, had pulled far too hard on his heavy control yoke, forcing his aircraft into an accelerated aerodynamic stall. He had entered a terminal death spin at an altitude where recovery was a mathematical impossibility. This visual confirmation fit perfectly into an emerging pattern recognized by the Imperial Japanese Naval and Army Air Forces. Throughout the brutal, sweltering months of 1943, Japanese combat logs, squadron diaries, and after-action debriefings from forward air bases repeatedly documented this exact phenomenon. Japanese fighter pilots frequently reported that when American P-38s were successfully cornered in low-altitude turning dogfights, they possessed a fatal tendency to snap roll and spin uncontrollably into the terrain. Armed with this intelligence, Japanese squadrons developed strict tactical protocols. A Zero pilot was explicitly trained and ordered never to follow a spinning aircraft down to the deck. This doctrine was rooted in stark logistical and physical realities. First, the Zero's primary killing power relied on two wing-mounted Type 99 20mm cannons. These weapons were devastatingly effective against unarmored targets, but they were fed by small, heavy drum magazines holding a mere 60 rounds each. Furthermore, the Type 99 cannon had a notoriously low muzzle velocity, meaning a pilot had to be incredibly close to guarantee a hit. A Japanese aviator could completely exhaust his entire cannon supply in less than 7 seconds of sustained firing. Firing on a doomed, falling aircraft was considered an unforgivable waste of precious ordnance. Second, following a 12,000-pound machine as it tumbled erratically toward the Earth carried a massive risk of a fatal mid-air collision. Heavy debris could shear off the falling plane and strike the pursuer, or the Japanese pilot, fixated on confirming the kill through his gun sight, could succumb to target fixation and slam his own lightweight fighter directly into the jungle canopy. Therefore, standard operating procedure dictated a clean, immediate break. When an enemy fighter entered a death spin, the Japanese pilot was instructed to immediately throttle back, pull the nose of his Zero up to conserve his own kinetic energy, and scan the sky for the next threat. Gravity and the jungle would finish the job. There was absolutely no need to shoot a dead man. But Major Thomas McGuire was not a dead man, and he had not lost control of his aircraft. He had deliberately surrendered aerodynamic stability in exchange for raw, unpredictable geometry. The terrifying plunge that looked like an aviation disaster was, in fact, a highly calculated mechanical deception. By weaponizing the Lightning's most notorious and deadly flaw, its violent tendency to snap stall at low speeds, McGuire was forcing the airframe to radically change its flight vector. Traditional evasion tactics dictated that a pilot should smoothly push the nose down, aligning the aircraft for a dive to trade altitude for airspeed. But a standard dive takes critical seconds to initiate, during which the aircraft remains squarely in the enemy's gun sight, presenting an easy, receding target. McGuire did not have seconds to spare, and he did not have the physical altitude to survive a gradual descent. The asymmetric thrust maneuver bypassed traditional aerodynamics entirely. By forcing the airframe to violently snap roll, McGuire radically and instantaneously altered his position in the sky. The massive wrench and torsion ripped the heavy interceptor out of the Zero's firing solution in a fraction of a second. Plunging inverted toward the mahogany trees, pinned tightly against his seat restraints by negative G-forces with the blood rushing to his head, McGuire was utilizing the sheer gravitational weight of the Lightning to literally drop completely out of the horizontal turning circle. He was hiding in plain sight, disguising an incredibly aggressive tactical descent as a catastrophic, fatal error. This mechanical deception, however, was only half of the maneuver. The plunge was a guaranteed death sentence if McGuire could not halt the falling mass of metal before it shattered against the earth. This was the razor's edge of his survival. Once he confirmed visually that the Zero had broken off its pursuit and pulled away, McGuire faced the terrifying task of arresting a fully developed inverted plunge in a heavy twin-engine aircraft with only a few hundred feet of vertical airspace remaining. He gripped the split-throttle quadrant and shoved the dead engine's lever violently forward, demanding maximum military power from both Allison V-12s. Simultaneously, he manipulated the flap lever, retracting the massive Fowler flaps just enough to shed the immense aerodynamic drag that was anchoring him to the sky, while keeping them partially extended to maintain an artificially enlarged wing surface area for maximum lift. He needed airflow over the wings, and he needed it instantly. The twin propellers, now biting savagely into the dense, humid tropical air with over 2,000 combined horsepower, blasted a massive volume of turbulent, high-velocity air back over the stalled wings and the rear control surfaces. The brute force acceleration of the two engines forcibly re-energized the disrupted airflow. The entire airframe shuddered violently, the aluminum skin groaning under the immense structural stress as the wings suddenly found purchase in the atmosphere. McGuire hauled back on the heavy control yoke with both hands, using every ounce of upper body strength he possessed. The unique twin-boom architecture of the Lightning, which made it so sluggish and difficult to handle in a slow-speed roll, now acted as a pair of long, highly stable levers, forcing the nose to aggressively track upward against the pull of gravity. The massive interceptor bottomed out of its plunge with terrifying violence. The propellers churned the humid air just feet above the triple canopy jungle, blasting leaves, vines, and tropical moisture into the furious slipstream as the aircraft leveled off. High above the jungle floor, the Japanese Zero pilot was completely oblivious to the resurrection occurring directly beneath him. Having broken off the attack exactly as his training dictated, he was pulling up, smoothly resetting his throttle and scanning the overcast horizon for his next target. He was entirely satisfied that the heavy American interceptor was already a burning wreck concealed within the dense foliage below. He had stopped turning. He had leveled his wings to regain his own energy state, but the spatial geometry of the dogfight had fundamentally changed. Because the P-38 had effectively dropped straight down out of the horizontal turning circle, it had drastically shortened its own path through the sky. While the Zero continued its wider turn above, the plunging Lightning had cut straight across the chord of the circle. By dropping and recovering in a much tighter radius directly beneath the fight, McGuire had radically inverted the tactical situation. As the P-38 roared up from the canopy, accelerating furiously on the combined power of its twin Allisons, it emerged perfectly in the blind spot of the climbing Japanese fighter. The Japanese aviator, looking forward out over his engine cowling and scanning the upper airspace, had absolutely no idea that the ghost of the aircraft he had just killed was rapidly ascending into his rear hemisphere. The heavy, concentrated battery of 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon housed tightly in the central nose nacelle of the P-38 was suddenly tracking directly onto the fragile tail of the Mitsubishi Zero. The trick worked flawlessly, turning a target into a hunter. But this mechanical deception carried a terrifying, hidden price. Using differential thrust to violently force a heavy twin-engine fighter into a snap roll, pushed the P-38 Lightning onto the absolute razor's edge of its aerodynamic envelope. This was not a standardized, repeatable combat maneuver tested and approved by engineers back in California. It was an incredibly aggressive exploitation of a lethal design flaw, born entirely of desperation in the skies over New Guinea. The margin for error was mathematically zero. The true danger of the maneuver did not lie in the sudden, violent plunge toward the jungle, but in the brutal physics of the recovery. By deliberately starving one engine of fuel and maxing out the other, McGuire was actively destroying the aircraft's lift and stability to escape the Japanese gun sight. But the moment he cleared the immediate threat, he had to instantly reverse the process and force the massive machine to fly again. This required the two Allison V12 engines to synchronize their immense power output flawlessly in a fraction of a second. If the throttles were not advanced with perfect simultaneous precision, or if the complex hydraulic systems driving the massive Fowler flaps failed to retract symmetrically under the crushing aerodynamic load, the controlled plunge instantly transformed into a genuine, unrecoverable flat spin. If McGuire misjudged his altitude above the jungle canopy by even 50 feet, the aircraft would lack the physical space necessary for the heavy control surfaces to bite into the air and arrest the 12,000-pound mass of metal. The conflict in the cockpit shifted dramatically. The primary threat was no longer the 20mm cannons of the Mitsubishi Zero. The threat was the pilot fighting the very aerodynamics of his own aircraft. Surviving the enemy meant actively risking suicide by physics, pushing a notoriously unforgiving machine to a limit it was never engineered to withstand. And over Wewak, McGuire was about to push it right to the absolute limit. That absolute limit was reached when the swirling dogfight spilled out over the coastline, pushing McGuire directly over the open ocean. Completely isolated and stripped of his wingman, his heavy fighter was wallowing at critically low speed. This time, he was not facing a single pursuer. Multiple Zeros had boxed him into a lethal converging crossfire, cutting off every horizontal escape route. Beneath him lay no forgiving altitude for a dive, only the hard, flat expanse of the Pacific rushing past just feet below his propellers. With tracers beginning to snap past his canopy, McGuire had a fraction of a second before 20mm shells shredded his airframe. He violently repeated the unnatural mechanical sequence. Inside throttle slammed to idle. Outside throttle jammed to the firewall. The 12,000-pound Lightning instantly rejected its equilibrium. The wing dropped, the nose snapped down, and the massive fighter tumbled inverted toward the waves. For the Japanese pilots closing in, the visual evidence was undeniable. The American had stalled and entered a fatal plunge. Flying dangerously close to the water themselves, the Zero pilots instinctively reacted to the terrifying proximity of the ocean. Following a spinning 12,000-pound aircraft down to the surface was suicide. Convinced they had secured a guaranteed kill, the Japanese aviators immediately broke off their attack, hauling back on their sticks to pull their lightweight fighters into a steep, climbing turn away from the water. But McGuire was not dead. Pinned against his harness, watching the ocean's surface blur violently into his windshield, he executed the recovery with mechanical perfection. He slammed the dead throttle forward and precisely adjusted the heavy Fowler flaps. The twin Allison engines screamed, their counter-rotating propellers biting savagely into the dense sea-level air. The sudden thrust re-energized the stalled wings. With the aluminum airframe groaning under the crushing G-load, McGuire hauled the yoke back. The Lightning leveled out so violently that the furious wash of its propellers carved a white wake directly into the ocean swells. He had successfully dropped completely beneath the crossfire. Above him, the Japanese pilots were still climbing away, bleeding off their speed and exposing the unarmored undersides of their fighters. Surging upward from the sea spray on 2,000 horsepower, McGuire brought the Lightning's devastating central battery to bear. He fired directly into the vulnerable bellies of the climbing Zeros. leaving the Japanese pilots to realize in their final seconds that they were being destroyed by an aircraft they believed was already at the bottom of the sea. The brutal, low-altitude engagements over New Guinea forced a fundamental shift in how the air war was fought. The survival of the P-38 Lightning was not the result of a sudden engineering breakthrough or a magical modification that suddenly made the heavy interceptor a superior dogfighter. It was born from the desperate, terrifying ingenuity of the men strapped into the cockpit. When rigid tactical doctrine failed them, and when the physical limitations of their machinery threatened to kill them, American pilots chose to actively weaponize the very aerodynamic flaw that was supposed to be their death sentence. They survived the undisputed domain of the Mitsubishi Zero not by outturning the enemy, but by shattering the psychological expectations of how an aircraft should fall out of the sky. The radical application of differential thrust proved that the ultimate limit of a machine is dictated entirely by the operator's willingness to push it past the edge of structural failure. It fundamentally changed the geometry of low-altitude combat, transforming a fatal disadvantage into a brutal, calculated deception. Survival over the Pacific required these American aviators to do more than just abandon their official flight manuals. It demanded the cold, psychological resolve to look a superior enemy in the eye and intentionally weaponize the illusion of their own death. In a hostile sky where the unforgiving physics of the dogfight overwhelmingly favored the nimble Japanese Zero, they uncovered a brutal, lasting truth of combat. Sometimes, the only way to survive a rigged game is to convince your opponent that you have already lost.